Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our event this evening. We're delighted that you can all be here, and we're delighted at the enthusiasm for the wonderful panel and discussion that we've got tonight. My name is Melissa Johnston. I head up the international program here at ASPI, and we're delighted to be collaborating on this Women in Defence and Security Network event with our colleagues at the Monash Centre for Gender, Peace and Security tonight. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land on which we are meeting, and pay respect to their elders, both past and present. We're really combining the best of both worlds, I think, in tonight's discussion. Emerging from, a bit of a brainstorming session we had probably a couple of months ago, we were looking for an opportunity to talk about some of the great research work that Monash has been doing. So we saw a great opportunity when they were looking to come up here to Canberra. And at the same time, we have a fantastic array of diverse career experiences amongst our panellists tonight. So we thought we could combine both in having a bit of a conversation about the research work that they've been doing, but in addition to that, how they got to where they are in their careers, which I think for all of them is a really fascinating story to have a discussion about. So before we get underway, I should note that we will be live tweeting the event this evening for anyone that is interested. And just letting them know. And I'll start with a few introductions in case you haven't had a chance to read the biographies of the people that we've got tonight, and I think that'll provide some good background as well for the discussion and potential questions around the work. So I might start by introducing our colleagues from Monash, both Professor Jacqui in the middle here, and Dr. Melissa Johnston. Professor True is a Professor of International Relations and Director of Monash University Centre for Gender, Peace and Security. She's an Australian Research Council Fellow, Future Fellow, and a Global Fellow, Peace Research Institute in Oslo. She received her PhD from York University, Toronto, Canada, and an honorary doctorate from Lund University, Sweden in 2018, and has held academic positions at Michigan State University, the University of Southern California, and the University of Auckland, as well as visiting fellowships at the Australian National University and Gothenburg University in Sweden. Her current research is focused on three areas of relevance to the broader women, peace and security agenda. Firstly, understanding the political economy of violence against women, including sexual and gender-based violence in conflict in the Asia Pacific. Second, examining the gender dimensions and women's roles in recruitment, support for and prevention of violent extremism. And analysing gender-sensitive peace agreements and their impact on women's participation after conflict. And among the many publications of books that she has authored or contributed to, she is co-editor with Sarah Davies of the Oxford Handbook on Women, Peace and Security, which will be coming out very shortly, and I know a number of people here in the audience are quite excited about that. The next event, we'll make sure it's available at the next event. Dr. Melissa Johnston is a postdoctoral fellow at Monash GPS. Her doctoral dissertation, The Political Economy of Gender Intervention, Social Forces, Kinship, Violence and Finance in Post-Conflict Timor-Leste, accounts for the uneven outcomes of gender programming by international development agencies. It argues the outcomes of international interventions on gender-responsive budgeting, laws against domestic violence and microfinance are shaped by power relations between men and women in a setting of elite dominance. In the Timor-Leste case study specifically, the political economy of kinship, as manifested in bride price or traditional dispute resolution, has been as crucial to class formation as it has in perpetuating gender injustices. Previously, Melissa has worked for the United Nations Industrial Development Organisation on Asia Pacific development and for Women Against Violence Europe on European Union programs to protect women from severe intimate partner violence. And in addition to that, we also have a colleague from UN Women who is joining us. Alison Davidian is currently a program management specialist on women, peace and security with UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific based in Thailand. Previous to this, she worked with UN Women's Peace and Security section in New York, where she led the Global Preventing Violent Extremism and Transitional Justice portfolios, and for UN Women in Uganda, where she managed the Access to Justice program. She has over 15 years of experience on development, gender equality and access to justice issues. Before her time at UN Women, she worked for organisations including the International Centre for Transitional Justice in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equality Now in Zambia, UNDP Somalia, and the Refugee Advice and Casework Service in Australia. there is ample there to talk about this evening in all that experience that we have with this. So I thought what I'd start off with is a bit of a discussion about some of the research work that you've all been involved in. If you could perhaps, we might start with you, Jacqui, on this one and then go to the others. But if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about what's consuming your time at the moment in terms of research work, and what are the things that have surprised you out of some of the research work that you're doing?
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. That was quite a mouthful. It's wonderful to see so many people at this event. Really fantastic. I have to say, you know, being a student of international relations, peace and security, now for a number of years, you know, when we were first in this field, there are very few women, so it's really fantastic also to see men here tonight as well, but it's really fantastic to see so many of you engaged in this field and in this sector. Okay, what's consuming us at the moment? Well, next week we are going to North Africa, so what's been consuming us is the mundanity of doing research in a region where governments basically don't want you to do any research. So we'll be next week convening 2 research capacity building workshops in Tunis, one for the Maghreb countries and one for Libya. And of course this week there's been resumption of conflict in and around Tripoli, and we've been trying to negotiate how our participants can actually physically get to Tunis for next week. So, I mean, you know, just to say, even when you're doing research, you know, in a field like this, it can be quite challenging. And of course, we can't physically ourselves go to Libya. Our university barely allows us to go to Tunisia, as we've been also working on this afternoon. Because, you know, we can't be covered by insurance and there's too significant risks. So what we're trying to do is really build the capacity of local researchers in these countries to begin to look at the problem of violent extremism and to look at it from the perspective of how underlying gender dynamics within communities might be part of that problem and might be fueling that dynamic. So one of the things that we've observed is that with violent extremist groups, one of the first things they do is actually target women's mobility in communities with curfews, target women's dress. You know, you need to be wearing this sort of veil, and now it's this sort of veil, and it needs to be this length. And you're in a school, and I know the first research we started doing in Indonesia started to document some of those changing directives around the appropriate forms of dress and veiling for women, and the increasing constraints around that. So I think you know, it's because of those sort of observations on the ground of you know, some of the changing practices that can be observed, sort of everyday things. You know, we sort of began to approach this field not from the point of view of you know, where is the latest terrorist attack and how many people were killed there, but rather what are the everyday forms of extremism and everyday forms of, I would say, also harassment, hate crimes, that may be condoned, ignored, neglected, and yet may be part of the mobilisation, the radicalisation of individuals and communities. So that kind of perspective is really important, I think, and I guess we kind of see our role not only in doing basic research, primary research, and certainly we've been able to do that in Asia, but also building the capacity of other researchers to look at the problem of violent extremism from a gender perspective, and to not assume that, for example, that young men and young women are attracted to groups purporting fundamentalist ideas in particular about Islam, for the same reasons. Because, I mean, you know, what we're sort of seeing is that actually, you know, young men and young women actually face quite different pressures within their families, within their communities and societies, and they might be attracted, therefore, by different aspects of that ideology, and also different, you know, kind of things that they're escaping in their own societies. So, and the point of having such a perspective, why bother, is because, you know, we actually want to stop the problem, right? We want to stop the violence, we want to prevent the problem, and if we want to prevent it, not after the act or not after the violent event, we need to really understand what are the root causes, what are the motivations, what are the things that are destabilising communities, and how can we address those at their root over the medium to long term, so that we're not always playing catch up. So I might just say that as an opening, and that perhaps some others can contribute.
No, I think that's a fantastic opening. And I mean, Melissa, you've been doing some research into bride price and a range of other things, and I guess going to some of these areas that hadn't been thoroughly researched years ago. What would have been some of the things you've been looking at?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the surprising things coming out of the research is just how much overlap there is. You know, there's always specific kinds of patriarchy operating in different places, but something like bride price actually speaks to a lot of different areas, and the way that it actually plays a role in all sorts of political economies, from Southeast Asia to North Africa, is actually really fascinating. So I'm not sure if everyone's aware that bride price is the payment of goods or money or jewellery and so on to the bride's family upon the marriage, or even throughout the duration of the marriage, and that these are globally very widespread. Around 70% of the world makes some form of marriage payment, and most of these are bride price payments, except in South Asia. They can be around 4 times the average income for a family, and so that's sort of, you're looking in a lot of places around, you know, $40,000, $100,000 US. So it's really a huge amount of money that has been completely invisible to researchers, because they've considered that to be part of the private sphere and women's concern. So yeah, and it actually, the commonalities, or some of those resonances from my PhD research to this research, that was the surprising thing, that, you know, we look at bride price in Timor, we see that that has a role in structuring the economy in such a way that violence against women is more prevalent, and then you come to look at something like violent extremism, and you see the same similar kinds of economic drivers of violent extremism, in that young men who would like to get married and can't, say in Morocco, where a quarter of people cannot get married and do not get married, even though that's societally expected of them. Young men might join a violent extremist group in order to be able to get that bride price together when they can't from their own families. It's a sign of status, it's a sign of class. And young women who would like to get married because this fulfills a societal expectation, and, you know, this is the dream. This is also a driver for them to be able to get married, to become an adult and fulfill and have a fulfilling life. So those kinds of dynamics are invisible to a lot of the mainstream research, and certainly surprising in the things we've done so far. But it is, I will emphasise, it's very under-researched, so what we say is not very certain yet.
No, I mean, it's a fascinating area to explore, and I guess, Alison, some of the work that you've been doing with UN Women has been looking at, I guess, concepts of masculinity and how these play into narratives around recruiting people to violent extremist groups, and some fascinating work around how to counter that with different narratives as well.
So at the moment, the thing that's been taking up my headspace has been the programming that we're doing in the region. We have 2 big programs, and one is the Preventing Violent Extremism program. And we're sort of, it's a pilot program in a lot of ways. It's the biggest program UN Women has at the moment. And we're sort of testing what works as we go along. The research is a big part of it, but also through implementing the program, that we're hoping that will also be an evidence base that other stakeholders can use as well for, you know, what works, what doesn't work, and how we can make increase the understanding of what are the gender dynamics of this threat. So one of the areas that we've been experimenting with is working with local comedians in the region to develop counter narratives, and we worked with a group in India called the East India Company, and also a group in Indonesia called the Cameo Project. And so the group in Indonesia did, it's kind of like almost like a short film, of a 10-minute video. There's this fictional group called HISIS, and it was showing how the marketing department of this group was trying to recruit more women to its cause. So they interviewed all of these women, and it was a very actually good show. I'll give you guys the links. And yes, they interviewed all these women, hoping that they would say great things for everyone to come, you know, should come to HISIS. And the results were not really what they expected. And then the other the other video was like 1.5 minutes and selling a product called Brainwash. And if you wear it, you don't have to have any original thoughts. Everyone can just mention it. So both had great reception. It was like 500,000 hits in a couple of days. And we just saw, that it was really quick and quite inexpensive way to make impact. It was localized content that could resonate with local youth. And it was fun to watch, people whatever thoughts they had, because we had a lot of, what we actually found out during this whole process was that people seem to be more angry about feminism than terrorism. Like some of the comments we got were quite intense, and that's great. I mean, I think it's great to start conversations and see how that pans out. So we're going to continue that work through this phase as well. Hopefully we will have new videos. We have narrative videos.
Oh, we look forward to seeing them. So I guess this brings me to the question, you've all kind of ended up in these fields of work that are very much focused on women, peace and security, or looking at the dimensions of gender and how they impact on different aspects of society. And I guess I'm interested in what inspired you, did you have an interest in this, or did you kind of fall into this field of work in terms of your careers? And I guess knowing a little bit of that story, for some people you kind of realise it quite late on in your career that you're really passionate about this or something that's happened to you in your career, and for others it's a passion from the beginning, I guess. So I don't know if you want to start, Melissa, maybe if you've got some thoughts. How did you get into this?
Yeah, look, so I sort of came from a sort of semi-practitioner background in that in Vienna I had worked in the UN, in United Nations Industrial Development Organisation, and done some fieldwork and things, and then sort of ended up working at Women Against Violence Europe, which was a quite decent research and implementing organisation, and had a lot of exposure to very sort of cutting edge policy around trying to reduce harm and stop intimate partner violence when it's they do these multi-agency interventions in a lot of places in Europe where a lot of different agencies get involved in trying to stop people from getting murdered or severe abuse. And then so I did some field work in Timor, and these sort of things came together around looking at class and violence against women, and that's where my big passion is looking at the way that socioeconomic factors interact with patriarchy in different ways. And then reading Jacqui's work was a bit of a revelation. I don't know, I urge everyone to look at the political economy of violence against women. It really connects those dots from the global level to the local level, and you can see how at every level violence against women has institutes and constitutes part of the economy as well. So that's sort of how I fell into it. Now I'm an early career researcher at Monash at GPS doing some really fascinating research. So, yeah, right. And research is my passion. I think you kind of know when you really just want to do that. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I mean, Jacqui, likewise. I mean, you're so well known for the work that you've done in this field, and in terms of contributing not only to, I guess, the Academy's work, but also public policy and influencing it. How did you start out?
Well, I think, one thing, I think everybody is sort of influenced by what are the kind of contemporary issues when they come of age. And for me, I always remember my university lecturer said, you should study Eastern Europe, because that was the fall of communism. You should head there, and that's what you should do. And but I would say that the major inspiration for me to continue to work in the field of peace and security and international relations really was being part of the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s. And it's actually fantastic to see that movement come back again and win the Nobel Prize, the ICAN social movement based in Melbourne and many other centres. And I suppose it's also really kind of thinking that this is a field that doesn't only get defined by what elite leaders in great power states have to say, but rather that people in movements, on the ground, even in the most conflict-affected, precarious places, can actually make a difference, not only to their own communities, but also to global politics. So I really believe that strongly, and I've seen that happen. And I feel that as a researcher, I wanted to be part of that, but I thought my role as a researcher is to try to make visible those actors and to try to bring to the fore and elevate in particular women peace builders who are doing so much, but often are doing it completely under the radar, without recognition, certainly without pay, but actually are really critical to realising those outcomes of peace and security. So if I think about, working on preventing violent extremism now, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, this would be what you're working on, I'd be like, I don't think that's my field. Not for me, that's all really too hard security. But I mean, I think it's, really, when you realise this is a really significant problem, and it's all our problem. And we really do need different perspectives and to harness all kinds of approaches to address it. And it just happened to be that I'd been working on sexual and gender-based violence. I was invited to New York by Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the law school at CUNY in New York, and they hosted a side event around, I think it was the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN. And the UK funded it. They wanted to do something on ISIS and sexual violence. So suddenly I got invited to talk about that, and I was like, okay. So I had something to say about that from a political economy perspective, trying to understand those underlying political and economic drivers, and why women in particular are targeted, because they're so vulnerable to violence, partly because of their relegation within those broader political and economic structures. And then, that was videoed and that went around. That was another one of those live things that we're doing now. And then I remember Sally Moyle in Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, she's the principal gender advisor, saw that. She's like, I think we need to do something on this in Australia. Could you do a project on that? And I think we had a conversation with Bill Eichler, who we saw this morning from the counter-terrorism part of DFAT. So we started working on it, and we'd had a PhD student working in Indonesia, so that's how we started working on it. We're working on it in a different way, of course. And then it's just kind of, I suppose it is a field where you get surprised. I didn't get to give my one anecdote about being really surprised.
Oh, please.
My best anecdote about being really surprised is visiting an Islamic boarding school in Cirebon, West Java. And we're having a sort of a sit down across, kind of kumbaya style. We met with the head of the boarding school, who happens to be a woman, and she's telling her story of how she works to counter violent extremism and how she came to be the head of a boarding school and in a position to be able to purport religious teachings in her community. And I thought it was just a brilliant example of, the power that you might say women religious leaders have in particular in this field. And her husband was, of course, the head of the boarding school, and he passed away. And the community was kind of, really concerned because, these quite traditional communities in Indonesia, where the community is actually very much revolves around the Islamic boarding school. This was a really central part of their life. So it was a concern that, there was no one who was going to replace this man. And so, there was no decision for quite a while. And she explained that she came to the community after about 6 months. She had a revelation, and she said to them, I've got there's a great person who's going to lead this school. You don't have to worry. It's going to be solid. God has spoken to me, and He has said that He will lead the school. Will lead it through me. I was like, wow, that's fantastic. She totally legitimized her power in that way. Wouldn't that be fantastic if we could all do that? But she also talked about some really difficult conversations she had with especially young men about the Quran, about particular teachings and Islamic stories, and the ways in which she engaged very seriously with them based on her religious learning and religious teaching. So I found that, frankly, as quite a secular person, hugely surprising, and yet could see that was also hugely effective.
Right, absolutely. And Alison, you sort of started off your studies in Australia and ended up at Harvard, and
Yeah, so I started here during refugee advocacy. When I came out of uni, I worked for the Refugee Advice and Casework Service in Sydney. I loved my job. It was fantastic. But I really always wanted to work overseas. And so I came to gender quite later in life. I thought I wanted to work for UNHCR. I must have written about, no joke, 100 applications to work for UNHCR. I think my name is on applications in every office in Africa. And so I ended up applying for a UNV, United Nations volunteer gig. And I ended up getting assigned to work in rule of law in Somalia. And I was like, cool, all right, let's do it. I actually, in my heart, was in refugee advocacy, but I was like, I really want to work overseas, and this is an amazing opportunity. How am I ever gonna? So I went, and I saw like the most devastating gender inequality. They gave me the gender portfolio because I was the only woman in the team. I was like, I don't know what to do with it. All right, yeah. And yeah, I mean, I saw some of the most devastating gender equality and some of those badass activists ever seen in my life. It was such an inspiring and troubling experience at the same time. And then after that time, I left very upset. I didn't really know what to do. So I went straight into my master's actually after that, and I took a class with Catherine McKinnon, who's and that was it. I was like, this is it. I've got it. This is it for me. I found it. So then I went back to East Africa and I worked in gender. I tried the same sort of situation. And now at this time I'm like around 30, and all my experience had been in refugee advocacy and rule of law. I hadn't really done any gender, except for trying to market the work I'd done as like the gender focal point. And so I was desperate to get a job in gender. I would have given my back teeth. And I managed to get like a fellowship, which the US universities give out. And so I went to work in the DRC and also in Zambia and built up the gender experience, and that led to a job at UN Women. And then I found it. Yeah, I love working on these issues. I mean, I've always been driven by the issues. But in terms of actual women, peace and security work, so I was working on an access to justice program in Uganda, and I'd worked on that for a couple of years, and then I was like, I'm going to take a break for a bit. What I really want to do right now is I want to study stand-up comedy. I just wanted a break, I wanted time out. So I went to New York. I was like, I'm just going to take some time out. I'm like tired. And I had best 3 months. I did stand-up, I did improv, I went to see every comedy show, and at the time, the supervisor of the program in Uganda, she was actually based out of New York. She's like, you're here? Right at that time, the woman doing transitional justice work in New York, lovely woman, but she was actually moving to do something else. She's like, would you be interested in staying in New York to take up the TJ work here? I was like, no. And that's when I started to learn more about, I think that's where I really started to learn about the craft of women, peace and security. It was a great experience, really. Yeah.
And I think like for so many people, it's you're thrown into a situation where you may not have had much exposure to it, and then you realise how much there is to look at, whether it's been under-researched or it isn't getting the voice that it needs, or all those types of things. And so I guess this brings me to, you're all engaged directly and work closely with women's communities and civil society and undertaking field-based research. And I guess the key question is, how do we amplify women's voices in political discussions and ensure that their perspectives are being included in the development of policy, whether it's at the local level, whether it's at the national level, whether it's at the international global level? Sort of, what are the mechanisms to do that you sort of realised through your work, perhaps? Maybe we might start with that.
Maybe I could just tell a story which I think talks about some of the mechanisms, also some of the challenges. So when I was working in Uganda, the Amnesty Act had come up for renewal. So in the year 2000, because of the conflict between the government and the Lord's Resistance Army, they'd introduced an Amnesty Act to try and stop the hostilities. And anyone could apply. It was a blanket amnesty. All you had to do was come forward and say, I renounce the rebellion, you'd be given amnesty. So it had come up for renewal, and now it was like 12 years later. The conflict had ended in 2006. And there were all of these crimes that people were just not being able to get justice for. You couldn't take any of the sexual and gender-based violations to court. it was impossible to get any sort of justice for what had happened. And so all of this time later, people were like, you can't, like, what about us? Like, these guys, they've just been given amnesty and we're just here living with these violations and not able to work. And so what we did was we did this whole bunch of consultations as the Act was coming up for review. We brought women from the north who had suffered the brunt of the violence to Kampala and brought government officials to come and they spoke about the importance of ensuring that there was accountability, that there was some kind of measure of justice for what they had experienced, that Uganda was in line with its international obligations to prosecute these crimes. And then we also did the consultations in the north, and we brought government up to the north to hear from them as well. So the Act, the part of the Act that had was giving a blanket amnesty was actually allowed to lapse. They got rid of it. And the reaction was very mixed. So while some people were very relieved, like now there would be a chance to get accountability for the crimes that they had experienced, there was a huge backlash. And the backlash came because there was such little awareness raising of what this meant. People were so scared in the north that the kids that had been abducted by their kids that had been abducted by the LRA would never come back because they would be prosecuted. That there was such an outcry that they actually brought the amnesty back. And what it showed, it reflected a few things. So basically all of the policy work that we had done and bringing together the women, the consultations, ensuring that there was a gender-sensitive analysis of the implications of that policy. It can't be done in a vacuum. You can have the best mechanisms. You can do everything. You bring women to the table. You make sure that the analysis is gender-sensitive. You have to have also much broader outreach campaigns, awareness campaigns. You're changing huge cultural shifts here. And unless there's a social norm sort of targeting activities and awareness raising activities that couples that policy work, it's always going to be a very hard balance.
And I guess for you, Jacqui, I mean, in terms of your role in academia and being able to influence and also share some of that research and the voices from the research that you're doing, what's the best way of sort of going about that? So we've had sort of this awareness raising one. You can't have it without some kind of, I guess, engaging the wider community.
I mean, it's, to segue also from Alison, I mean, I think that in terms of changing those underlying social norms, that's actually where education comes in, and the role of not only universities, but all of the educational institutions in our society. And so I feel like that's, universities are really well positioned, especially if they partner, with civil society, with government, and other, like they reach out to the community, because one of the things that we can do is we can have really frank, honest public conversations, and we can be critical of government policies, and we can then wrap around some research around some of those perspectives and provide some evidence, which then can speak back to some of the gaps, the neglects, the inadequacies of the existing policies that we have. But I guess what I would say, to your earlier question, Lisa, about how do we elevate women, peace and security, or in particular women's experiences and voices where they may be neglected in this field. I mean, I think that is a joined up effort. It has to be. And I think that's what's so exciting about this field, is that we can see already a kind of community of theory and practice, that we can work together quite well across boundaries of policy, practice, and research. And we understand that in this field, if we are actually going to make any kind of change, which is ultimately social change, we actually do need to do it together. We need to coordinate, we need to recognise and respect the different roles that we have. And I'll just give one example, I think, of the role that research has and the things that we can do as academics to also convene. And it's not from the research with UN Women, but it's from some research with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and other partners in the Ukraine. So, many of you will know Ukraine has an ongoing conflict in the Donbass region. But this is actually a problem common to many conflict areas. So, and in Ukraine, it's kind of rather special because the government there hasn't had a lot of resources to actually even fund the conflict. So the people who are kind of clothing the soldiers, feeding the soldiers, caring for the injured soldiers are largely women in communities, often in displaced communities. They're sort of picking up the slack of the state, even when the state's military spending is increasing. And you might have seen this week, for example, the US giving a whole lot more weapons to Ukraine. So, and it's, you know, that's really interesting to observe, right? That broader community effort within a conflict context, which is, you know, where communities are actually quite divided. And then in those communities that have been displaced and that are also trying to recover from conflict, and where, you know, community organisations are trying to build peace within that, and they're trying to, you know, kind of reintegrate those displaced communities. Who's doing that work? Again, it's very highly feminised. In who's running the NGOs? It's women. But what else are they doing in those communities? They're also really actually still responsible as a result of quite a traditional gender division of labour for the everyday survival of their families. Feeding them, caring for them, children and elderly. So they're doing that all on top of also kind of trying to engage in this relief effort. And also then, in some other cases, still kind of actually supporting, provisioning the war. So I think it's really important to make visible that work because it's unpaid, it's not visible, it's certainly not being really supported. And why that's important, this is also happening in Syria, by the way. Who is kind of recovering local communities, so basic governance services are provided. And it's often women leading these efforts. But what happens once you have a peace agreement and in comes the international donor funding and the organisations, is that infrastructure that's been, you know, pieced together, admittedly, by, you know, local communities, that's often just ignored and run roughshod over. And then those, you know, those individuals, those communities have actually been quite resilient, are not really the basis for the rebuilding. And their labour and their skills and their knowledge is not fully recognised. And this is happening over and over again in communities. So in the Ukraine, what we've done is we've said, okay, we're going to develop a method, a new method, and we're actually going to document this work. We're going to count it. We're going to do something called, we're going to pilot ethnographic time use surveys. And we are going to look at conflict households and non-conflict, and we're actually going to show what actually is involved in maintaining a household and a community in this situation, and be able to show the kind of additional work that women are doing and what that actually means, you know, hour by hour. And then once that's recognised, then, you know, the hope would be then when donors do come in, there's actually some kind of, you know, there's actually some kind of counted, visible recognition of that work, and something that can be further invested in and supported and built upon. So that's a totally new idea, and who knows whether that will pan out. But right now the partners in the various NGOs, not only WILF, but Fina till Fina, which is the largest Swedish women's rights organisation, I mean, they're basically talking to the European Investment Bank, NATO, you know, things that they can do, because now they have some data, right? They have an evidence base, they can show what's happening here, and what can be built upon.
And I guess part of it is actually just documenting that work that is going on and ensuring that other people have visibility of what's been taking place rather than being ignored. And Melissa, from your perspective and your work, what do you see as some of the critical levers, I guess, to make sure that some of these stories and voices are being heard?
Yeah, so I talk about it at a very local level because that's where my field research experience is. And I'd just like to kind of point to the fact that, you know, we have this kind of local turn-in peace building going on in a lot of agencies, and that requires a bit of rigorous gender thinking sometimes. So when you're looking particularly at something like violence against women in post-conflict situation, there are some steps you need to take. You know, you have to be well versed in the language. It helps if you're doing ethnographic work to really live in people's households and see what goes on, and that way you avoid some of the elite bias that sneaks in or that, you know, plagues this kind of research. And that means also questioning what people tell you. These are the traditions of the place that we have. This is just common sense. especially around violence against women, that really might lead a whole lot of stuff that's going on. So we need to ask. It's not just about amplifying women's voices, although that a woman-centered approach is of course what you would take in violence against women research, but also about probing gender relations in a really rigorous way, not just accepting when someone tells you, well, this is a tradition, this is how we've always done it, this is traditional dispute resolution. Asking what does that comprise, who gets the balance of power when that resolution is over, what kind of money is changing hands, what kind of compensation takes place, who benefits from that compensation, and is it women that are benefiting, or is it power holders and brothers and uncles and that kind of thing. So it's about opening up that black box of the family, and women often have to make certain patriarchal bargains within families, and I'd also say at the national level, so when you're moving up the level, I think it's also important to look at the patriarchal bargains that women have to make to live in the society that they are, and that happens in Australia as well. We might look at Julie Bishop, and the kind of state that women leaders live in really, that really shapes what they're going to say and what kind of voice they're going to have. But that's not to accept it uncritically, but also to maybe look at what gender power relations are behind that.
Yep, no, absolutely. I was wondering how long it might take us to get to the Australian domestic political context. On that note, we might open up to the audience for some questions for our panellists. We might take a couple. And I know we've got Susan down here in the front.
I have a very quick one.
And if there aren't any questions later, then maybe I'll have a deeper one. When can we get ethnographic data on time use in the Ukraine? Or am I putting the cart before the horse?
We're working on the policy brief as we speak, Susan. Yeah.
Does that mean that there's data that's going with the policy brief?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
G'day, okay. It's commendable that you're recognising women's efforts to maintain the home front during conflict, but I remember an anecdote from East Timor where they did empower the local female population. They got trades, they were running businesses, rebuilding their communities, and when the blokes came back from the conflict, they were disempowered and the rates of domestic violence increased. Are you looking at that side of the issue as well, where you've got all these men with nothing to do and they are disempowered?
Might take one or two more questions. Any more? Oh, we've got one there.
I was just interested in the craft of women, peace and security. I thought it was a wonderful term, and I'd just be interested. I'm sure it's a very lengthy description, but if you could sort of do it in 10 dot points.
Yeah.
That would be helpful.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, we might throw across to our panellists. We might start with the Timor question and then move on to the craft question, which will give Alison some time to document some points.
Yeah. So as I understood it, it's more about how do we bring something like the deep knowledge around what happened in Timor to women-run businesses in the post-conflict to other research. And I think women research, or feminist researchers, I'm going to use the F word, feminist researchers working on women's economic empowerment have always been pointing to those gender dynamics in the household, especially around something like microfinance, right? A lot of my other work also addresses the really perverse outcomes that you can get around debt and around donor money coming in, especially, in fact, in the Timor case, and things like interest rates, a very unexamined part of that. As far as examining this in our current research, we definitely look at men returning the household dynamics. But I think Jacqui was also talking about households that are also already in conflict, like not even keeping the home front going, but trying to live with everyday violence, or did I misunderstand? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's slightly different than keeping the home fires burning, right?
Yeah. But I also think actually the method of ethnographic time use survey, it would be quite genuine. Obviously, what it means is the researcher, I mean, the method is a little bit complicated, but just to summarise briefly, I mean, one of the where you actually observe what the person is doing and you're actually jotting it down, you're unlikely to, in that context, to observe gender-based violence. You might observe arguments. Then the second part is where you go back the next day and you interview the person, why did you do that and who was that to the benefit of and what was happening there. And why, by the way, in Ukraine time use survey, do men do nothing? Except for when it's a security thing, drive the car or feel they have to escort. That was quite striking to me. And even in the context of where you have, and I mean, again, it's quite a small study in 10 sites in the Ukraine. 4 of them are in the conflict-affected area, and 1 in an area affected by austerity. But just to see that that men have so much leisure time, even while these women are actually running the household, running 2 jobs because one has been cut. And so they needed to get another job, and it's usually kind of using the internet or related to a family business in another, or a farm or something like that. It's moonlighting, and just to notice those gender dynamics, and that's really concerning. But so okay, the purpose of that method is to make visible women's labour and women's peace building and contributions in order that they are recognised in the recovery phase. But another dimension of that, which you aptly point to, is is really what might that actually say also about men, and so we are actually observing only the woman. We would say the woman head of household, right? Although there may be a male breadwinner as well in that. So we did have single-headed, female-headed households, and we did have large households with many internally displaced. Like the family is very large because it's taken on orphans and so on. But I think that's always a really important question. But I guess also the question with research is that whilst we want to have a holistic view, and I definitely think that's part of the women, peace and security craft, we also need, for feasibility and as we need to kind of look at one piece at a time, and then bring that all together. And gender-based violence is something that often is the first priority to look at in a conflict situation. People don't always look at, women's labour and how and remuneration, and their ability to be employed after conflict.
The craft of women, peace and security. Okay, I think that. The heart of the women, peace and security agenda is a simple, but it's a revolutionary principle, and that is that peace is inextricably linked to equality between men and women, and that's radical. And then from that comes all of the principles that we've been rallying around. The need to ensure that women are part of the decision making that leads to the future of their own countries. The need to ensure that women are part of rebuilding their countries and peace building. The need to basically treat women as equal citizens. And the Women, Peace and Security agenda provides a foundation for that. There's been over 2,000 resolutions that have been adopted since the Security Council was established. But I don't think that there is any resolution that is known more for its name and its content than 1325. And this is a resolution unlike any other. It was born out of a constituency of women civil society organisations. This was women civil society that brought these claims to the table and got the Security Council to listen. It's awe-inspiring stuff, and it continues to inspire all the work that we do.
I think that's a fantastic summation. Probably got time for a couple of more questions before we wrap up the discussion. I think we've got one in the back here from there.
So we've talked a lot about the WPS aspect in an international arena. I just want to come back to what does this look like from a domestic space within Australia?
That's a really good question. And is there anyone else? Oh, yes, McCready.
So I was just thinking, how do we deal with patriarchy that is supported and even perpetuated by women, especially from an older generation in different cultures? That's the question.
Another good question. And is there, oh, we've got one from Jane in the back.
I'd be really interested to understand how your recent, particularly ethnographic research informs how you conduct your own gender analysis, and how you would shape practitioners' use of gender analysis tools, particularly in terms of operating overseas for a military. Thanks.
Some great questions there for the panel. We might go now. This might be the last round of questions, so I'll throw back to Susan, and then we'll go to our panel for the final discussion.
I was really interested in the work that you're doing around bride price. I saw that Valerie Hudson has been doing a bunch of stuff in that space, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about the findings that you have and how it relates to her work.
Fantastic. Next article.
I'm sorry, I missed your question at the. Yeah, I missed it.
Yeah, so what I was really interested in is how your recent, particularly ethnographic research,
informs the way that you either advise others or conduct your own gender analysis, and what you, sorry, I feel like that's about to go off,
and how you would advise defence or military personnel in conducting their own gender analysis on operations.
So I think we've got some questions there around the domestic sphere, patriarchy and sort of different generations, the question around ethnographic analysis and gender, and also bride price. So
was Deb's question about was it how women, peace and security should relate to Australia domestically? Oh, that's a great question.
Would you like to start with that one?
I've been harping on about that all day. Well, I mean, I think the great thing, I mean, let's keep with this women, peace and security crowd, right? The great thing about women, peace and security is it knows no borders. It's not about what happens over there. It's about what happens here, there and everywhere. So, and it is in many respects a challenge to state sovereignty. And to note that state sovereignty has by and large not protected or secured women. Okay, it's not made them safe. So we do need to understand the continuum of violence against women from within the home and community to in more precarious situations at the border, in conflict-affected areas, in abusive, precarious employment sites, which are often transnational, which are often migrant. So all of those things, we need to see the connections between them. And so, in many respects, women, peace and security is about understanding that. Now, how it translates when we suddenly have national action plans it may not be institutionalized in that way, but that is the inspiration. So the inspiration goes back to really during World War I, when women activists from Europe and the United States, I mean, this is just one origin story, okay, and this is a global north one. There are other, backstories. But this one is where women activists, some of them were suffragists, really wanted to stop the slaughter during World War I. And they were connected because they were also connected through the suffrage movement transnationally. They were working together to try to change their government's policies during the war. They convened a conference in The Hague in 1915. They travelled around Europe. They talked to soldiers and their families about the war. They were able to talk to some leaders of countries, but remember, at that point, women did not have political rights. So they actually had and states the thought of women having a conference about peace and war. It's like, oh, ridiculous. What would they have to say about that? And yet they came up with a 20-point plan, which then Woodrow Wilson subsequently, in his 14-point plan, many of those principles are kind of reflected there, and it was about the legal resolution of conflict. It was about international law. It really prefaced the establishment of the League of Nations. So I mean, and they were concerned about, you know, all forms of violence, and they were concerned about building peace in communities. So it was based on their understanding at the time of working in communities, and in communities which had migrant populations, diverse populations, and poverty. So they were trying to take that model of, in a way, kind of said, you know, sort of reconciliation and social work. They were trying to take that into the international field, and that is still what we're trying to do. So even, you know, and that is being reflected, you know, in different ways by many different actors. But I guess what that means, women, peace and security in Australia has to be domesticated. It has to become part of what we do at home as well as abroad. And I think, you know, I think that Australia will only be able to stand out as a leader, you know, in terms of trying to advocate for gender equality and women's rights in conflict-affected countries, to the extent that we, you know, we really take note of those issues within our own jurisdiction, and we are able to also give a voice to migrant women from conflict-affected countries who have, you know, genuine knowledge and expertise that should be part of, you know, really shaping our foreign aid and security policies. So, you know, I think lots of people in the room will have lots of suggestions about that. It has to become a movement, not just a government policy or an institution or a research project. It has to be a movement. It is a movement. It's been a movement for over a century, and, you know, I think, you know, we've made a lot of progress in the latter part of the 20th century, leading up to 1325, and so, I mean, we kind of see this as a long-term project, but one which is urgent. So that's all I've got to say. Yep. Alison?
Maybe I'll just take the patriarchy question. Right. So, I mean, I think this touches on what Jacqui was saying before, that, you know, we all have to be involved. It's a whole range of different activities have to be at play, from the policy realm to the programming to the research. But I think the key thing here is, and this is the key thing that the challenge that we're confronted with, I think it's making it, why would a man who has privilege, what does that man have to gain from gender equality? Like, I think that's the question that we need to answer. Like, how is gender equality relevant to them? How does it benefit them? Why would they even want to invest in it? How do they make it their own? And there's more and more research that's coming out. There's a great images survey that's been done that, you know, documents the benefits of gender equality for all, not just more marginalised male members of the community, but also for the most privileged as well. Economically, socially, mental health-wise. I mean, we can go into the sort of documents, but I think that's a key question that has to be answered. It's a relevant one. Why would privileged men want to invest in an agenda that doesn't seem like it has anything to gain from them? And I think that's the question that we also have to confront day to day in the field as well when we're implementing programs.
No, I think that's a very good point in terms of how you approach that broader engagement piece for all. I think, and there was also a question around bride price and the work that was happening there.
Sure. So obviously I'm pretty up with Valerie Hudson's work. She has put together an amazing database. If anyone has not seen it, I urge you to take a look at women's stats. It's a really big compilation with some great graphics around women's status in law, around marriage, around the different ways that bride gift and so on flow, with these nice global pictures. I guess Valerie Hudson's argument is something like that bride price is a long hidden driver of conflict and driver of violent extremism, and she makes two sort of interrelated arguments for why that is. The first is one that I touched on earlier today around young men having to assemble huge bride prices. They are really, really quite substantial from their male kin, and one way that poor men, or all men, can do this is to join a violent extremist group, right? Because they will pay the bride price, or alternatively engage in human trafficking, sex slavery, this kind of thing, right? The other argument that Valerie Hudson makes, drawing on some anthropological data from the Nuer, I think, and Afghanistan and some other cases, is around the shape of the state in such societies where you're talking about patriarchal tribes having, and she really means patriarchy in the classic sense of being controlled by male members of the family, right? So there's a lot of merit to Valerie Hudson's argument. I think she's right in a lot of ways, but I disagree with her on some key points. One of which is that she says that bride price is a flat tax. Now, whether or not she says that because she's American and she would like such a system, but in fact, in my research, I find it's not a flat tax. Rich men charge more for their daughters, and poor men can't charge as much at all. So in fact, what you have is a manifestation of a class system, and it's usually a 4-tier class system. So my argument, and what makes it slightly different, is that instead of it being driven only by this kind of really functionalist argument around young men needing to join to get the bride price together, it's also about social conflict and about a way that young men can challenge the class order and overturn it.
I think there's some really good concluding thoughts there. I'm conscious that we're moving on with time.
We have a couple more questions we didn't know.
We didn't get to Jane's question up the back.
Can I quickly answer that one? And you were going to answer that one too.
Oh, which one is that one?
About
older
women.
Oh, older women.
Yeah, but I can quickly answer that one. I mean, I actually think you've raised a great question, and I'm not fully aware of all the different methodologies that, for example, militaries use when they're in the field to understand the community context in which they're based. So but it would be great to have a discussion. I would imagine something like an ethnographic time use survey pilot type thing could be a rapid kind of measure in which you could do a needs assessment in a community of who's doing what, when, and how, and what are the needs and priorities. I think it could be very effective, and the reason why we developed this is because time use surveys are used, very large, have been done in development assessments on a national scale, right? They take a huge amount of time, and they expect the person, usually a woman, to keep a diary of what they do. And why that's not very effective, and in very poor communities or communities which are really time poor, right? And especially in a conflict-affected situation. So the ethnographic part there becomes, the observation. It means it doesn't take any extra labour of the individual in order to kind of generate that data. But it does require some time to interview that person, to reflect on how they use the time and why, and then to be able to analyse that. And I think, I don't know if you're only thinking of that particular ethnographic method, but I think what you get there is a kind of a, it's a one-time shot understanding of the political economy of the household. And if you did it in a number of sites, you can get a kind of overview of what the political economy of the community might look like from the vantage point of the household. And the household in those situations often, the heart of the political economy, and yet that's not going to probably feature. I imagine that's not a kind of assessment that you would do in the military at present. Maybe or not. Maybe we can chat after. But it's not the it's not the normative methodology in a conflict assessment.
So older women and patriarchal bargains, I guess that kind of talks a little bit to what the line that I had before. And I guess academics we don't have all the answers. So I don't have a firm. All I would say is that it's not surprising. I think in many social systems, older women are the enforcers of the patriarchy, or the particular patriarchy in which they live. Stepmothers being the classic example. Stepmothers enforce things like foot binding, or really quite hardcore controls over their stepdaughters, and that's because one of the only ways they can access through power is through their sons. So I think there's a historical precedent for older women's reluctance to change the system which they've have made their bargain with.
No, thank you. And we can continue the discussion over some drinks and canapes in a moment. I think it's been fascinating to hear your insights, the research you're working on, some key, lessons around the fact that we need to be cognizant that women, peace and security has no borders. We need to be looking at the broader sphere. We need to be considering power and privilege and how all these things influence the work that we're doing, and particularly for those in policy or conducting research and their day-to-day work. So on that note, I won't try to summarise everything else other than to say thank you very much to our panellists. If you could join me in thanking them as well.